Richard Vale kicked the janitor's mop bucket over, and gray water spread across the marble lobby like a slow stain. "People like you don't speak in this building," he said, straightening his cufflinks while 200 employees pretended not to watch. "You clean. You disappear. You don't offer opinions about my security systems." And 10-year-old Eli Bennett, sitting on the lobby bench where he always did his homework after school, watched his father set down his cloth, kneel on the wet floor, and begin wiping up the water without a single word of protest. Thomas Bennett did not argue. He soaked up the spill, wrung the cloth into the righted bucket, and nodded once at the man who had just humiliated him in front of the entire company. Eli's hands curled into fists around his pencil. He wanted to stand on the bench and shout the truth at all of them. But he didn't know the truth yet, not the whole of it. He wouldn't understand what his father had built inside those walls for another 2 days. And what Richard Vale didn't know, as he walked away laughing, was that within a single week he would be standing outside a sealed steel door, pleading for the help of the very man he had just called invisible. To understand how a janitor earning a modest wage came to hold the future of a defense technology company in his weathered hands, you have to go back before the mop bucket, before the marble lobby, to the man Thomas Bennett had been in a life he never talked about. Thomas had raised Eli alone since the boy was 3. Eli's mother had passed after a long illness, and in the quiet years that followed, father and son had built a world just large enough for two. Their home was a one-bedroom above a hardware store, and every surface of it held some small evidence of a boy who asked too many questions and a father who never tired of answering them. Thomas worked the evening shift as a custodian at Vale Dynamics because the hours let him walk Eli to school every morning, and because a steady, quiet job was exactly what a man who wanted to be forgotten needed. Because Eli was not an ordinary 10-year-old. He remembered things, patterns, sequences, melodies, the way other children remembered the taste of their favorite candy. He could hear a song once and hum it back note for note a year later. And that gift had been shaped, without either of them ever naming it, by the lullaby. Every night since Eli was a baby, Thomas had hummed him the same strange, winding tune. Not a nursery rhyme, not anything from the radio, but a long sequence of rising and falling notes that Eli had never heard anywhere else in the world. "Where's it from, Dad?" he would ask. "From a long time ago," Thomas would answer, and turn off the light. Eli never questioned why a man who mopped floors for a living could glance at the most advanced electronic locks in the building and mutter, almost to himself, that they'd been installed backward. He was too young to wonder how his father knew such things. But the truth always finds a way to surface, and this truth had been humming quietly between them every single night for 10 years. If you've ever been treated as though you were invisible, if you've ever watched someone you love be dismissed by a person who wasn't fit to carry their tools, then stay with me, because what Eli does inside that building will turn this whole story on its head, and I promise the ending is worth every second. And if this story is already reaching you, take a moment to subscribe, because moments like the one coming are exactly why this channel exists. The reason the mop bucket humiliation ever happened was an argument Thomas should have known better than to enter. Vale Dynamics was preparing to unveil its newest achievement, a vault-sealed server room that housed the company's most valuable research, protected by a security system the company claimed was unbreakable. Richard Vale had been giving a tour to a group of investors, boasting about the door that no one on Earth could open without authorization, when Thomas, passing with his cart, had quietly remarked that the sequence logic was flawed, that a system like that should never lock out its own creator. Vale had turned on him like a man swatting a fly, and the bucket had gone over, and the lesson, as far as Vale was concerned, had been taught. But life has a strange way of humbling the proud. 2 days later, the unthinkable happened. The vault door sealed itself shut, permanently, locking every bite of the company's research behind 18 inches of steel. A power surge had corrupted the master credentials, and the failsafe, designed to protect the room from intruders, now refused to recognize anyone at all. Vale Dynamics had a demonstration for the Department of Defense in 7 days, a contract worth hundreds of millions, and their entire life's work was now trapped behind a door that would not open for the CEO, the engineers, or the manufacturer who had installed it. Eli learned all of this the way children learn important things, by being small and quiet in the corners where adults forget them. He sat on his lobby bench and listened to the panic ripple through the building. He watched teams of specialists arrive in expensive coats and leave with their heads down. He watched Richard Vale's confidence curdle into fear. And on the second evening, while his father emptied wastebaskets down the hall, Eli wandered closer to the sealed vault than he had ever been allowed. drawn by a sound only he could hear. Because the door was making a noise. A soft, cyclical tone the failing system emitted every 30 seconds as it searched for a credential it would never find. To the engineers, it was meaningless feedback. But Eli went very still, and his heart began to pound, because he knew that sound. He had known it his entire life. The tones the dying lock was singing into the empty hall were the exact rising and falling notes of the lullaby his father had hummed him to sleep with every night since he was a baby. He found Thomas in the supply room, and his voice came out in a rush. "Dad, the door. It's singing your song. It's singing my lullaby." Thomas turned around slowly, and the color drained from his face. He set down the box in his hands, lowered himself onto an overturned crate, and for the first time in Eli's memory, his steady father looked as though the ground had shifted beneath him. The truth came out in the supply room that night, in the gentle, careful way Thomas gave his son every difficult thing. 12 years earlier, Thomas Bennett had not been a custodian. He had been the lead systems architect who designed that very vault, the security genius whose work Veil Dynamics had been built upon. He had encoded the master override not as a password that could be stolen or a card that could be lost, but as a melody, a sequence only he would ever know, because he believed the safest key in the world was one that lived inside a person rather than on a piece of plastic. But when the company grew and the money grew with it, Richard Vail had forced him out, rewritten the records, claimed the designs, and erased Thomas so thoroughly that no one remembered the quiet man who had made the whole thing possible. Thomas had walked away with nothing he cared to fight for except his son, and every night since, without ever telling the boy why, he had hummed his greatest secret over Eli's crib like a prayer. "Then why did you let him treat you like that?" Eli whispered. "You built the door. You built all of it. Why didn't you tell them?" Thomas pulled his son close. "Because a man who needs everyone to know his worth," he said quietly, "hasn't understood it yet. I wanted you to learn that first. But the truth always finds a way to surface." On the 5th day, with the deadline closing in and the research still entombed, a desperate notice went out through the building. Anyone, any employee, any contractor, anyone at all, who could open the vault would be rewarded beyond their imagining. And Richard Vail, pale and sleepless, never once imagined the answer had been mopping his floors the entire time. It was Eli who refused to let it go. "You told me the whole reason to know something is to help," he said, standing in the supply room doorway with his arms crossed exactly the way his father stood when he meant it. "You told me a gift you hide isn't a gift. So help them, Dad. Not for him. Do it so I can watch you do the right thing." So Thomas Bennett walked into the atrium where the executives stood arguing before the sealed door. Richard Vail saw him and sneered through his exhaustion. "The janitor. Come to mop up our failure?" Thomas said nothing. He walked to the panel beside the great steel door, and instead of typing anything, instead of touching a single card or key, he simply began to hum. The low, winding, rising and falling notes filled the silent atrium. The engineers exchanged baffled glances. And then, deep inside the wall, something ancient and patient recognized the voice of the man who had created it. And 18 inches of steel released with a heavy, echoing sigh and swung open. The atrium was utterly silent. Richard Vail stared at the open vault as though he were watching the dead rise. "How?" he finally managed. "How is that possible?" And it was Eli who answered. The 10-year-old boy stepped out from behind his father, walked to the center of the room, and looked up at the most powerful man in the building. "Because he built the door," Eli said, his voice clear and unshaking. "He built all of it. The key was never a password. It was a song he's been singing to me my whole life. You called him invisible, but you've been living inside his mind this entire time. You just never knew whose it was." No one moved. The engineers who had spent 5 days failing now understood, all at once, that they had been outmatched from the beginning by a man they had walked past 100 times without seeing. The company's research was recovered. The demonstration went forward, and Veil Dynamics survived. Richard Vail, humbled in a way money could not undo, offered Thomas a title, an office, a salary that would have changed everything. But Thomas Bennett shook his head. He shook the man's hand, because he had promised his son he would do the right thing, and doing it meant leaving cleanly. And he said only one thing before he left. "You spent years protecting what's behind that door. You should have spent them learning who was standing in front of it." That night, father and son walked home together along their familiar street, the hardware store glowing warm at the end of the block. Eli slipped his hand into his father's and looked up at him. "You could have taken the job," he said. "We could have had everything." Thomas smiled and squeezed the small hand in his. "Eli," he said, I hummed you that song for 10 years so you'd carry a piece of me even when I couldn't be in the room. Tonight, you carried it back to me in front of the whole world. There isn't a vault built that holds anything worth more than that. And as they turned the corner toward home, Thomas began, softly, to hum the lullaby. Only this time Eli hummed it with him, note for note, the two of them filling the quiet street with a song that no longer belonged to just one of them. Lessons from this story. First, the true measure of a person is never the title on their door, but the character they keep when the world refuses to see them. Second, a gift kept hidden helps no one. The strongest among us are those who use what they know to lift others rather than to be praised. And third, the greatest inheritance a parent can leave is not wealth or a name in a record book, but a child who carries their goodness forward and gives it back when it matters most. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. Tell me, if you were in Eli's place and you suddenly realized the secret to everything had been sung to you every night of your life, what would you have done in that room? Your opinion matters. I'd love to hear your thoughts.